You may think God changes your life by changing your circumstances. Sometimes he does. But one of the most important ways God changes your life is far less obvious. He changes the way you think. And the strange part is that you may not notice it happening. Romans chapter 12 verse 2 says, "Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind." Notice the order. Transformation is connected to renewal. God does not merely tell you to behave differently. He begins changing the mind from which your behavior comes. That matters because your actions usually follow your interpretation of reality. Change what you believe, and you begin to see differently. See differently, and you begin to choose differently. Choose differently long enough, and your life begins to look different. But here is what many Christians miss. A renewed mind does not necessarily feel like a completely new mind. Sometimes it feels like becoming uncomfortable with the thoughts you used to accept. Think about that. There was a time when a particular temptation felt normal. Now it bothers you. There was a time when anger seemed justified. Now something inside you tells you to stop. There was a time when you desperately needed everyone to approve of you. Now you can walk away without needing their approval. Nothing dramatic happened outside you, but something changed inside you. That is one of the first signs that God may be changing the way you think. Ephesians chapter 4 verse 23 says, "And be renewed in the spirit of your mind." The mind is not treated as irrelevant to spiritual growth. Your thoughts matter. Your attitudes matter. The way you interpret people matters. The assumptions you make matter. Because what repeatedly occupies your mind eventually influences what you call normal. And this is where the process becomes uncomfortable. God does not simply replace every wrong thought with a pleasant thought. He exposes thoughts you did not realize were wrong. You may discover that what you called wisdom was actually fear. What you called discernment was actually suspicion. What you called confidence was pride. What you called peace was avoidance. And what you called freedom was actually slavery to a desire. That is why spiritual growth can feel like losing yourself before you understand that God is rebuilding your thinking. The Bible repeatedly presents this renewal as a process. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 verse 18 says that believers are being changed into the image of the Lord from glory to glory by the Spirit. That means Christian transformation is not presented as one emotional moment after which every thought becomes perfect. It is progressive. God keeps exposing. God keeps correcting. God keeps teaching. God keeps reshaping. And eventually, you begin responding differently because you're seeing differently. This explains something that can confuse Christians. You can know a Bible verse intellectually and still need God to transform the way you think about the situation that verse addresses. You can know forgive, but knowing the command is different from seeing the person who hurt you through the lens of forgiveness. You can know trust God, but knowing that sentence is different from actually interpreting uncertainty without assuming that everything is falling apart. You can know love your enemies, but knowing those words is different from reaching the point where revenge no longer feels like the obvious answer. The information may enter your mind quickly. The transformation usually takes longer. And this is why Scripture is not merely information for the Christian. It becomes a means through which your thinking is confronted and reshaped. You read a passage. At first, you think it applies to somebody else. Then you realize it is exposing you. You reread it. A familiar sentence suddenly means something different. You pray about it. Then you encounter the same situation in real life. And now you have a choice. Return to the old pattern, or respond according to the new understanding. That moment matters, because renewal becomes visible when your new understanding survives contact with an old temptation. Anyone can feel spiritually changed during an emotional moment. The harder evidence is what happens when the same trigger appears again. Someone insults you. Do you automatically retaliate? Or do you pause? You experience rejection. Do you immediately conclude that you are worthless? Or does your understanding of your identity challenge that conclusion? You fail. Do you interpret failure as proof that God has abandoned you? Or can you now distinguish between failure and abandonment? The circumstance may be identical, but your interpretation is different. And that changes everything. This is why sometimes God does not immediately remove the situation that keeps frustrating you. The lesson may not simply be about escaping the situation. It may be about changing the person who is experiencing it. You keep asking, God, when will this change? And sometimes the deeper question is, God, what are you changing in me while I am waiting? That question can completely change how you experience a season of life. Because a difficult circumstance can remain difficult while your relationship to it changes. The pressure is still there, but fear no longer controls every decision. The temptation is still there, but it no longer has the same authority. The disappointment is still real, but it no longer defines your identity. That is what renewed thinking can look like. Not the disappearance of every difficult thought, but the gradual loss of their control over you. And there is another part most Christians overlook. A renewed mind changes what you notice. You begin noticing motives. You recognize patterns. You detect compromises earlier. You become more sensitive to what once seemed harmless. You start asking different questions. Not merely, can I do this? But, what is this doing to me? Not merely, is this popular? But is this true? Not merely, what do I want? But what does God want? That is a profound shift, because maturity is not simply knowing more Christian information. It is learning to interpret life differently. Romans chapter 12, verse 2 connects the renewed mind with discerning the will of God. In other words, God is not renewing your mind merely so you can win Bible quizzes. He is renewing your mind so you can recognize what is good, what is acceptable, and what is pleasing to Him. The goal is not simply a smarter Christian. It is a differently oriented Christian. So pay attention to the changes you normally overlook. The temptation that no longer attracts you the same way. The anger you now recognize before it controls you. The pride you can finally see. The desire for approval that is slowly losing its grip. The scripture that suddenly exposes something you once defended. The decision you would have made differently 5 years ago. Those changes may seem small, but they are evidence that your thinking is being reshaped. And perhaps the biggest mistake is expecting God to change your mind by making every decision for you. He can guide you without removing your responsibility to think. He can teach you without eliminating your choices. He can renew your mind while still requiring you to practice what you are learning. So do not only ask God to change your circumstances. Ask Him to change the way you see them. Do not only ask for a different life. Ask for a renewed mind capable of living differently inside the life you have right now. Because sometimes the first evidence that God is changing your life is not that your situation has changed. It is that you have changed the way you see it. And once God changes the way you think, you may begin making choices you could not have imagined making before. That is how transformation becomes visible. It starts inside, then it reaches your choices, then your habits, then your character, and eventually, your life begins revealing what happened in your mind.